Welcome to The Psychology of Us. This podcast is created by RJ Starr, a public intellectual and independent psychology educator. The material presented is educational and interpretive, examining psychological life as a domain of understanding rather than intervention. It does not provide therapy, diagnosis, or professional guidance. Each episode stands as a complete work of public psychological inquiry.
The last time someone literally screamed at you over, like, a minor political disagreement.
Or, when you see a comment thread just completely devolve into existential threats over a local zoning law.
Right, exactly. Those people weren't glitching. I mean, they weren't just being stupid.
No, and they weren't necessarily acting in bad faith either.
Which is wild to think about. Because according to this 30-year psychological framework that we're unpacking today, their brains were actually executing a flawless, highly efficient, 100,000-year-old survival program.
It completely inverts the standard narrative, doesn't it? I mean, we look at the vitriol, the absolute refusal to compromise.
The blood sport of it all.
Yeah, exactly. The way a simple policy discussion instantly becomes a blood sport, and we just assume we're witnessing a mass malfunction, like human rationality is simply breaking down.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We're really thrilled you're here with us joining this conversation, because we know the kind of listener you are.
You're someone who wants to understand the complex systems running under the surface of our world.
Right. You want to get past the overwhelming, exhausting noise of the daily news cycle. And you are looking for those real, aha moments of pure structural insight.
And today, we have a massive one for you.
We really do. We are dismantling an essay titled Politics as Psychological Regression by Professor RJ Starr.
What this essay does is it's remarkably rare in our current climate. It takes a massive step back from the specific arguments we're all having.
The daily controversies, the outrage cycle.
Right, all of that. It ignores it and looks entirely at the underlying cognitive machinery that's producing those arguments in the first place.
But before we go one sentence further, we have to lay down some absolute non-negotiable ground rules for this deep dive.
Definitely.
We are not here to debate the merits of the political left or the political right. We are absolutely not taking sides.
And crucially, neither did the author of our source material. Professor Starr's work is meticulously impartial.
Yet his essay operates strictly at the level of explanation, never argument. He isn't critiquing any specific movement or, politician or ideology.
We're looking structurally at how human thinking itself alters under extreme pressure.
To put it in mechanical terms, we aren't arguing about the direction the cultural car is driving.
Yeah, who should be allowed behind the wheel?
Exactly. We are popping the hood, dismantling the engine piece by piece, and examining how the pistons physically behave when the temperature hits the red line.
So let's unpack this engine, because the hook here, the central revelation we're exploring today, is that the aggressive, seemingly irrational political behavior we see everywhere,
it isn't a sign of a broken society.
No, it's the human mind adapting highly efficiently to a high-threat environment.
It's a profound paradigm shift.
Yeah.
When you stop seeing political tribalism as like a moral failure,
right,
and start viewing it as a predictable biological and psychological adaptation to specific environmental pressures, the chaos suddenly has a deeply logical structure.
It does. But to understand how the mind collapses under this kind of political pressure, we first have to understand the architectural blueprint of the mind itself.
We need to know what a healthy structure looks like before we can understand the mechanics of how it cracks.
And that brings us to the architect of this framework, Professor RJ Starr.
Right. So to understand the essay, you have to understand this specific, rather unusual lens through which it was written. Starr is an independent psychology educator and scholar.
And the word independent carries a lot of weight here.
Yeah.
He operates entirely outside the traditional constraints of a university department.
I'm curious about that choice, actually. Because usually when we see the title professor, we expect like a prestigious university affiliation trailing right behind it. Why intentionally stay outside that system?
Well, it comes down to how academic institutions structure incentives.
Okay.
In a traditional university setting, there is immense pressure to publish frequently, to chase novel, highly specific hypotheses.
Carving out a micro niche.
Yeah, and securing grant funding. Starr intentionally avoids all of that to maintain full authorship and absolute control over a cumulative body of work.
He isn't interested in short-term engagement or episodic research papers.
Exactly. He's been building a singular, interconnected system for decades.
This is a 30-year life's work. It spans dozens of books, formal papers, essays, and courses. He calls this overarching framework psychological architecture.
And it's important to clarify what he's not doing. He is not a licensed clinician treating individual patients for symptoms like depression or anxiety.
Right, so he's not sitting in a room doing talk therapy.
No. His background is rooted in observing complex, high-stakes human environments.
Like what kind of environments?
He spent years analyzing organizational hierarchies, institutional dynamics, spaces where people have to operate under sustained pressure.
Often with competing loyalties and highly ambiguous authority structures, right?
Yes, exactly. He watches people operating in the wild, so to speak.
And from watching those complex systems, a core question emerged that drives all his work. What governs the coherence of a human life, and what causes that coherence to fail?
Coherence is the key term there. He's asking how all the disparate parts of us,
Our cognitive processing, our emotional regulation.
right, our deeply held identities, our systems of meaning, how all of that somehow holds together and functions as a unified whole.
Because mainstream psychology frequently approaches human behavior through categorical oppositions, right? Like you are deemed healthy or disordered.
Yeah, a behavior is labeled adaptive or maladaptive.
I see that a lot. It's a very binary way of diagnosing the world.
Well, Starr argues that those categories, while perhaps useful for a quick clinical diagnosis, only describe surface events. They're purely descriptive.
They don't explain the underlying structural mechanics producing those events.
Exactly. Psychological architecture attempts to map the actual load-bearing systems of human experience.
Let me try to visualize this for you listening, because this distinction fundamentally changes how we view the rest of the material. Imagine society, or even just your own mind, as a house.
Okay, a house.
Lately, we've all been walking through this house and noticing massive, jagged cracks forming in the drywall. The traditional, symptom-focused approach is to look at the wall and say, those cracks are ugly and dangerous. Let's get some spackle, patch them up, and paint over them.
We treat the symptom.
Right. We launch campaigns telling people to be more civil online, or we try to aggressively fact-check the shouting.
Which is an exercise in futility if you don't understand why the drywall is splitting in the first place.
Exactly. Starr doesn't even bother looking at the paint. He grabs a flashlight, bypasses the living room entirely, goes straight down into the basement and says, the concrete foundation is literally shifting beneath us.
The load-bearing beams are warping under sustained pressure.
Yes. He is looking at the hidden architecture of how we process reality.
And what he finds in that basement, looking at those warping beams, leads directly to his thesis on modern politics.
When he examines how our psychological foundation handles the specific relentless pressures of the modern political environment, he identifies a structural failure.
And he uses a very specific term to describe this failure: regression.
Now, here is where it gets really interesting, because we need to completely redefine regression.
We really do.
When I first read that word in the essay, my mind immediately jumped to an adult curled up in the fetal position, or like an internet troll throwing a childlike temper tantrum.
Right. It sounds like a moral judgment.
It feels like an insult.
But Starr is incredibly careful to strip the word regression of all that inherited baggage. Historically, the term comes from early psychoanalytic theory.
Like the Freudian idea.
Yeah, the Freudian idea of retreating to an earlier, less mature stage of childhood development when faced with stress. Starr isn't using it that way at all.
So he removes the clinical pathology and the moral framing entirely. So if I'm arguing with someone in a comment section about tax policy, and I suddenly resort to calling them a sociopath, Starr isn't saying I'm acting like a toddler.
No, he's saying something much more mechanistic. For Starr, regression simply denotes a shift in the level of psychological functioning.
It's a functional reallocation of cognitive resources.
Exactly. And to grasp this, we have to map out the two distinct levels of functioning he describes: higher order and lower order.
Let's break those down, starting with higher order functioning, because this is the aspirational stuff.
This is how we all like to believe we operate on a daily basis.
The rational, deliberative, calm thinking.
The defining characteristic of higher order functioning is that it's extraordinarily resource intensive. It demands a massive caloric and cognitive output from the brain.
It's also developmentally acquired, right? We are not born with the innate ability to engage in complex policy analysis.
No, not at all. We have to learn it, cultivate it, and practice it.
What are the actual mechanics of it? Like, what does higher order functioning look like when it's running smoothly?
Well, it involves sustained reflective thinking. It requires the ability to reason across time.
Meaning you can accurately project into the future and contextualize the past without distortion.
Right. And most crucially, it involves the capacity to sustain ambiguity without forcing a premature resolution.
Okay, sustaining ambiguity, that's a big one.
It is. It's the ability to hold two competing, perhaps contradictory ideas in your mind without immediately deciding one is purely virtuous and the other is absolute evil.
It also requires the discipline to separate what you personally deeply believe from what can be empirically demonstrated.
Which is incredibly hard.
Honestly, just hearing that list makes me tired. It requires a tremendous amount of mental bandwidth.
It requires a safe environment, ample time, and a significant cognitive surplus.
Contrast that with lower order functioning.
The basement of the brain.
The primitive software.
Primitive is the right word, provided we don't equate primitive with defective.
Right.
Lower order processes are fast, they are automatic, they are intimately tied to our deepest biological survival imperatives.
So instead of the tired cliche of running from a tiger in the jungle, let's use a modern example.
Let's hear it.
It's the physiological spike of adrenaline you get when it's Sunday night, you're relaxing, and you suddenly see an email notification pop up from your boss.
Oh, no.
And the subject line says, "Urgent? We need to talk tomorrow morning."
That is a perfect modern analog.
Right.
Because in that split second, you aren't engaging in higher order reflection.
Not at all.
You aren't weighing the probabilities of what the meeting might be about or sustaining the ambiguity of the situation. Your lower order functioning takes over instantly.
It involves rapid threat detection.
Yeah.
It involves immediate categorization, safe or dangerous.
Exactly.
My heart rate spikes, my stomach drops, and I instantly assume I'm getting fired. The brain forces a binary resolution to the ambiguity because the ambiguity feels physically unsafe.
The core structural argument of Starr's essay rests on this dynamic. When the demands placed on a human mind exceed its current capacity or available resources, the higher order functions are suppressed.
They aren't destroyed or unlearned.
No, they're simply overridden or made temporarily unavailable. The lower order functions take the wheel. Why? Because they are vastly more efficient in a crisis.
Hold on, I'm struggling with this.
What's the sticking point?
If you're saying regression is natural and biologically efficient, are you just giving people a free pass?
How do you mean?
Aren't we providing a biological excuse for people to act like absolute monsters to each other in the political arena? Like, why shouldn't we hold them intellectually accountable?
Well, explaining a mechanism is not the same as excusing the damage it causes.
Okay, that's fair.
Understanding how a fire spreads doesn't mean you endorse the house burning down. But if we want to stop the fire, we have to know what feeds it.
So when people act completely illogically in a political debate,
ignoring verified facts, screaming slogans, demonizing their neighbors,
they are deploying survival tools.
Yes. Lower order processes have kept the human species alive for hundreds of thousands of years. Fast, binary, automatic threat detection is an excellent solution to a very specific class of problems.
Namely, acute, immediate physical danger.
Exactly. The breakdown happens because we're taking the cognitive machinery designed to dodge a falling rock, and we are forcing it to solve complex, nuanced 21st century structural problems.
You cannot solve international trade disputes, healthcare infrastructure, or intricate social justice disparities using the mental software designed for immediate physical survival.
When you try, the brain inevitably distorts the reality of the complex problem to force it into the binary, threat-based processing of the lower order mind.
This raises a massive, glaring question.
Which is?
If regression is an emergency override, like a temporary natural response to acute pressure, why does it feel like this collapsed state has become the permanent baseline reality of modern political life?
The emergency never seems to end.
Right. What is the environment doing to us that keeps us trapped in the basement?
That leads directly into the core of Starr's diagnostic work. Regression does not happen in a vacuum. It is triggered and stabilized by highly specific environmental conditions.
So the environment is doing this to us.
He identifies 3 interacting mechanisms in the modern world that essentially hack the human mind, locking it into a state of continuous regression.
Let's dissect these 3 triggers. What is the foundational one?
The first is sustained threat perception.
Meaning we are walking around feeling constantly endangered.
Biologically, the brain reallocates its resources under threat. The prefrontal cortex, which handles the slow, reflective, higher-order thinking, dials down its activity to conserve energy.
And the amygdala, the threat detection center, dials up.
Exactly. But modern society has introduced a fatal glitch into this biological system.
An acute threat, like swerving to avoid a car crash, resolves in seconds. You survive, the adrenaline fades, and your brain resets to baseline.
But human beings are unique. We react to perceived social threats with the exact same physiological intensity as physical threats.
Really? The exact same?
Yes. The brain codes social ostracization, loss of status, or a threat to our group identity as a life-or-death scenario. Because historically, being kicked out of the tribe meant literal death.
And a perceived social threat doesn't require a physical event to happen right in front of you.
No.
It only requires a narrative. It requires a story that your brain believes is credible.
And our modern political and media ecosystems are spectacularly, unprecedentedly effective at generating and maintaining narratives of existential threat 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
They are coming for your children.
They are going to destroy the economy.
They are fundamentally evil.
Right. The population is no longer experiencing intermittent acute stress. They are submerged in a bath of chronic, unyielding threat perception.
And chronic threat reorganizes the physical architecture of the brain. Regression becomes the new default operating system.
That is trigger number 1, sustained threat.
Wow. Okay, what's the second?
The second trigger is compressed attention.
We simply don't have the time or the mental space to think anymore.
To engage in deliberate, higher-order processing, you need 3 non-negotiable elements.
Which are?
Sustained attention, low ambient stress, and sufficient time.
If I look at the design of any major social media platform or, turn on a cable news panel, I'm looking at an environment mathematically engineered to destroy all 3 of those elements simultaneously.
The interfaces are explicitly designed to defeat deliberate processing. The content comes at you in rapid-fire succession.
And the emotional valence.
The intensity of the anger, the fear, the outrage.
It's dialed up to the maximum possible setting.
Furthermore, the reward structures, the algorithms, the likes, the retweets, exclusively reward immediate, impulsive, highly emotional reactions over considered delayed responses.
We are constantly flooded with existential threats, and we have 0 time to process those threats logically.
The fast processing doesn't just assist our judgment, it replaces it entirely.
Which brings us to the third trigger, the mechanism that locks the whole regress system into place.
Identity salience.
Salience meaning prominence or importance. How much our identity dominates our perception in a given moment.
Right. As social creatures, a massive portion of our self-concept is derived from the groups we belong to.
Okay.
When there is intergroup tension, when us is engaged in a high-stakes conflict with them, our group identity becomes hyper-salient.
It moves to the absolute forefront of our cognitive processing.
Exactly.
How does that actively change the way we think about information? Like day to day?
Well, when a political identity becomes your primary hypersalient social identity, it begins to organize your fundamental perception of reality.
So you no longer process a piece of information to determine if it is factually accurate or empirically true.
No, your brain processes that information solely to determine if it is consistent with your group's survival.
Oh, wow. So if someone presents me with a piece of data that contradicts my group's narrative, I don't experience it as interesting new information.
Not at all.
I experience it as a threat to my tribe.
Disagreement ceases to be an intellectual challenge. It becomes a literal social threat to your belonging.
The very function of political engagement shifts.
You aren't trying to understand the complexity of the world. You are trying to maintain the psychological coherence of your identity.
Let's step back and look at how sustained threat, compressed attention, and identity salience interact. Because this is a horrifying feedback loop.
It is incredibly tight.
The constant narrative of threat heightens your identity salience. You cling to your political tribe for protection.
Right.
That heightened identity salience narrows the range of information you're willing to process.
And the compressed attention of the media environment ensures you never have the slow, reflective time needed to interrupt the cycle.
It is a perfectly closed loop.
It's brilliant in a terrifying way.
It reminds me of the smartphone battery.
Oh, the low power mode analogy.
Yeah. When your phone drops to 2%, the operating system senses a critical lack of resources. It senses a threat to its survival.
So what does it do?
It automatically shuts down all the complex background applications. It stops fetching new data. It dims the screen.
It terminates all the higher order functions and leaves only enough power for the absolute basics.
Low power mode. The device sacrifices functionality for survival.
And what Starr is showing us is that the modern political environment has drained our collective cognitive batteries to 2%.
We are operating in a permanent psychological low power mode. We have shut down the applications required for nuance, deep empathy, and complex problem solving because our environment demands all our energy just to detect the next threat.
That leads to the most critical part of this analysis.
Okay, where do we go from here?
If our cognitive batteries are stuck at 2% and we are running strictly on lower order survival software, what does that actually look like when we attempt to solve a complex societal problem?
How does the brain compensate for the loss of its higher functions?
Starr outlines 3 specific modes of cognitive collapse. When we are trapped in this regress state, our day-to-day thinking degrades in highly predictable patterns.
What is the first mode?
The first is binary thinking. We touched on this earlier.
The tolerance for ambiguity.
Yes. The ability to look at a situation and say, this is incredibly complicated and there are no easy answers. That is a high-cost function.
When the mind is stressed and regressed, ambiguity becomes physically aversive. It feels dangerous.
Because if the situation is ambiguous, you don't know where the threat is coming from.
The stressed mind forces a categorical resolution. It demands black and white. Every issue, no matter how complex, is reduced to purely good or purely bad.
You are 100% with us, or you are the enemy.
Let's apply this to a real-world example, like a local town meeting about a new zoning law.
That's a great example.
Say a developer wants to build a multifamily apartment complex in a neighborhood of single-family homes. In a higher order state, this is a complex debate about infrastructure, traffic patterns, property taxes, and affordable housing.
There are legitimate pros and cons.
But under regressed binary conditions, the complexity vanishes. The debate is no longer about traffic patterns.
No. Side A decides the building is an absolute moral necessity, and anyone opposing it hates the poor.
And Side B decides the building is a malicious plot to destroy the neighborhood, and anyone supporting it wants to ruin their way of life.
Imposing a binary structure on a complex system doesn't simplify the system, it violently distorts it.
And when policy decisions are made based on those distorted binary maps, they almost inevitably cause further destabilization,
which creates more real-world problems.
Elevating the threat perception and locking the regression in even tighter.
Exactly. That is the first mode. The second mode of cognitive collapse is identity fusion.
Identity fusion. Okay. Under normal conditions, my political affiliation is just one slice of my overall self-concept.
Right. You have a political leaning, but you're also a parent, a neighbor, a fan of a specific sports team.
Someone who loves a certain type of music. My identity is multidimensional.
But under regressed conditions, that political identity rapidly metastasizes until it absorbs all the other dimensions of the self.
So your politics begins to determine who your friends are, where you're willing to shop, what art you consume.
And your overarching moral standing in the universe.
It consumes the entirety of your being.
And the neurological consequence of this fusion is profound.
How so?
If your entire sense of self is fused with your political position, a political disagreement cannot be processed as a debate over abstract ideas.
It's processed neurologically as a literal physical attack on your personhood.
Yes.
This explains the absolute intensity of modern discourse. It explains why a disagreement over that zoning law instantly escalates into screaming, severed relationships and people wishing death upon each other.
They aren't just being dramatic. Their brains are genuinely signaling that their existence is under attack.
It's the predictable, structural outcome of identity fusion in a high-threat environment.
We have binary thinking and identity fusion. But the third mode of collapse.
This is the one that I think is the master key to this entire deep dive. This is the concept that really shifted my perspective.
Starr calls it moralization as adaptive compression.
We need to spend a lot of time on this.
We do. This is undoubtedly Starr's most nuanced and vital contribution in the essay.
The lazy popular critique of our current discourse is to look around and say, everyone is so self-righteous. People have substituted moral grandstanding for actual analytical thinking because they're intellectually lazy, or they just want to signal their virtue to their tribe.
You hear that constantly. They are just virtue signaling. They don't actually care. They just want to look good.
Starr argues that framing is entirely too simple, and it misses the underlying mechanics.
Right. Moralization is not a failure of sincerity. People are not faking their outrage.
Moralization is the default mechanism the human brain utilizes when analytical processing becomes too biologically costly or too slow for the environment it is in.
Let me challenge this, actually, because it's a tough concept to swallow.
Yeah, please do.
It is so incredibly tempting to look at someone who turns a mundane logistical disagreement into a grand cosmic battle between good and evil and assume they are just being manipulative. How is turning everything into a moral crusade adaptive?
Consider what a moral judgment actually provides the brain.
Okay.
In a high-threat, high-speed environment, you must make decisions and align with your group instantly. Analytical thinking is agonizingly slow.
It requires gathering evidence, weighing competing probabilities, acknowledging counterarguments, and running complex mental simulations. That takes days, weeks, or years.
By the time you've analyzed the data, the metaphorical threat has already destroyed you.
A moral judgment, however, is instantaneous.
It provides absolute, unyielding certainty, and most importantly, it allows for immediate, frictionless coordination with your group.
Let's go back to our town meeting about the zoning law.
Okay, perfect. Let's run that scenario.
If I stand up and say, I oppose this building because I believe the proposed tax structure is mathematically inefficient and will create a municipal deficit in 5 years, what happens?
Well, we have to sit down, pull out spreadsheets, hire economists, and do the math. It requires massive higher-order functioning.
But if I stand up and say, I oppose this building because the developers are evil, greedy monsters trying to destroy our families, I don't need math.
You bypass the intellect entirely.
You instantly know who is on your side, and your group can coordinate and act immediately. Moralization acts as a form of data compression.
Oh, like taking a massive gigabyte-sized computer file that would take hours to download and zipping it into a tiny folder so you can email it in 3 seconds?
Exactly.
Moralization compresses the complex, messy, statistical reality of the world into a tiny, easily transmittable packet of pure outrage or pure virtue.
That analogy captures the mechanism perfectly. It solves the brain's problem of cognitive overload.
But the societal consequence of this adaptive compression is utterly devastating to public discourse.
It is, because when a political position is held as a moral absolute rather than an empirical analytical claim, it becomes entirely immune to evidence.
This is the terrifying part. If I believe a policy is practically flawed, and you show me undeniable data proving it actually works, I have the capacity to change my mind.
Your higher order functioning can update the model.
But if my lower order functioning has already categorized that policy as morally evil, your data is irrelevant.
In a moralized cognitive framework, counter-evidence is not processed as new information. It is processed as a provocation.
It's seen as a deceptive trick deployed by the enemy.
The debate ceases to be a mutual good faith search for understanding. It becomes a rigid, immovable contest between two moral absolute positions that simply cannot, by their own internal logic, ever be revised.
Perception narrows to a pinhole. Complexity collapses.
Protecting the identity takes precedence over understanding reality. The brain is locked in the basement.
And that is merely what's happening inside the mind of the individual.
Which brings us to the macro level, the most daunting part of Starr's analysis, the system at scale.
Everything we just explored, the binary thinking, the identity fusion, the moralization as compression, that describes one person's brain in a regressed state.
What happens when you scale this up?
Right. What happens when our institutions, our media, and millions of citizens are operating in this exact same collapsed state simultaneously?
When regressed functioning becomes the default across an entire population, the macro begins to mirror the micro.
The entire societal system reorganizes itself around that lowered level of cognitive functioning.
And Starr outlines 3 massive structural consequences of this societal reorganization.
Consequence number 1, the shift in coordination. How does a regressed society actually accomplish anything?
Well, in a healthy system characterized by broadly available higher-order functioning, society coordinates through argument and debate.
We look at evidence, we engage in shared reasoning, we weigh the trade-offs, and eventually we negotiate a compromise.
It's slow, it's frequently frustrating, but it produces highly durable agreements because people have genuinely updated their positions based on shared information.
But we just established that in a regressed state, nobody is updating their positions. Counter-evidence is treated as a threat. So how do we coordinate action?
The mechanism shifts entirely. Society begins to coordinate through shared moral framing and mutual threat perception.
We organize into massive political tribes based almost entirely on who we mutually hate and who we mutually fear.
You have to vote for us, or the other side will literally end the country.
And this form of coordination isn't necessarily less efficient in the short term, is it?
No, in fact, shared fear can mobilize millions of people rapidly. You can absolutely win an election using mutual threat.
But it's fundamentally, structurally unstable.
A coalition built solely on threat only lasts as long as the threat narrative is maintained.
If the narrative shifts, or if the fear subsides even slightly, the entire coalition shatters.
Because there's no actual analytical agreement or shared vision holding the pieces together.
It's a house built on sand, requiring constant earthquakes to keep the sand packed tight.
That's a grim way to put it, but yeah.
What is the second macro consequence?
The second is the destabilization of disagreement.
Disagreement is supposed to be the engine of a healthy democracy. It's how we uncover our blind spots.
In a higher-order system, disagreement introduces crucial new variables and tests the structural integrity of our ideas.
But in a regressed system,
Disagreement is no longer productive, it is an existential threat to the tribe.
if your political platform is held on absolute moral grounds, you cannot tolerate any internal complexity or dissenting voices without risking the fragmentation of your coalition.
This makes me wonder about the psychological toll on the people trying to maintain nuance.
Yeah, what happens to the person who stands up in the middle of this chaos and says, actually, the reality is quite complicated. Both sides have valid points on this specific issue, and we need to look at the data.
Starr's observation on this is chilling. The regress system actively, aggressively suppresses those individuals.
It doesn't necessarily censor them through formal legal means, but it creates intense social incentives that make nuance incredibly costly.
People who maintain higher-order thinking in a regressed environment become what Starr calls structurally anomalous.
Structurally anomalous. They no longer fit the architecture of the conversation.
The system literally does not know how to process them. A binary system cannot compute a non-binary thinker.
So how does society handle the anomaly?
It forcibly attempts to assign them a tribal label. It subjects them to aggressive purity tests.
If you criticize a policy on the left, you are immediately branded a far-right extremist.
If you criticize a policy on the right, you are instantly labeled a radical Marxist.
The system cannot tolerate the terrifying idea that you might simply be an independent person thinking analytically.
It has to force you into a known category so it knows what weapons to use against you.
The psychological toll of being the person in the middle is profound cognitive dissonance and severe social isolation.
You're subjected to the hostility of both sides because your very existence threatens the simplicity of their worldview.
If you refuse to pick a side in a binary war, both sides will turn their weapons on you.
Which leads directly to the third and ultimate outcome of a regressed system at scale.
The fragmentation of shared reality.
We hear this phrase constantly. Pundits lament that we are living in different realities, that we are suffering from a terminal misinformation crisis.
Starr provides a massive correction to this popular narrative.
He does. He argues that the fragmentation of our shared reality is not fundamentally an information problem.
It is a processing problem.
This is a crucial distinction. We operate under the assumption that if we just expose people to the correct facts, the right spreadsheets, the verified data, we will all magically converge back into a shared reality.
But shared reality requires much more than just mutual access to the same information.
It requires shared cognitive operations.
Yes. It requires a shared set of reasoning procedures.
It requires a shared tolerance for uncertainty. It requires a mutual willingness to revise deeply held positions when presented with conflicting evidence.
This fundamentally alters how we view the whole industry of fact-checking.
If my brain is running on the analytical, higher-order operating system, and your brain is running on the moralized, threat-based, lower-order operating system, correcting the data doesn't fix the divide.
We can sit at a table, look at the exact same spreadsheet economic data, and draw two completely violently incompatible conclusions.
The information is processed through fundamentally different operations and produces fundamentally different outputs.
Correcting the input does not fix the corrupted processing software.
When we see two people engaged in a bitter, screaming political argument, we assume they are arguing about facts.
Starr is showing us they aren't.
What looks like a political disagreement is actually the mutual incomprehension of two biological systems operating at entirely different levels of psychological functioning.
They're speaking two incompatible cognitive languages.
And the ultimate tragedy of a society that has stabilized in this regressed configuration is that it forecloses the very capacities it needs to heal itself.
The capacities required to self-correct a society?
Deep reflection, ambiguity tolerance, the willingness to revise policy based on outcome.
Are precisely the capacities that regression suppresses. The system has locked itself inside the basement and thrown the key out the window.
That paints an incredibly stark, sobering picture of the world we are navigating every day.
It really does. But as we bring this deep dive to a close, it's vital to remember that Starr's architectural framework isn't just a bleak diagnosis of the damage.
It provides a highly specific mechanical lens through which we can figure out what to do next.
It fundamentally changes what we are looking at, which changes how we approach the solution.
Let's retrace the path we've taken today.
We started by looking at Professor RJ Starr's structural approach, moving past the noisy symptoms of our political chaos to examine the load-bearing architecture of the human mind.
We saw how modern political conditions, the relentless manufactured narratives of social threat,
The severe compression of our attention by digital media,
and the intense fusion of our identities force a functional reallocation of our cognitive resources.
we learned that regression is not a moral failing or a sign of mass stupidity.
It's a highly efficient biological adaptation to an overwhelming environment.
It forces the brain into binary moralized thinking because moralization compresses data faster and cheaper than complex analysis.
We saw how, when this happens at a societal scale, it shatters our shared epistemic reality.
We replace the slow coordination of argument with the rapid, unstable coordination of mutual fear.
But here is the final, crucial thematic resonance of Starr's work. Despite how dark the diagnosis is, the framework itself is profoundly empathetic.
The ultimate conclusion of his structural account is a call for deep structural empathy.
A system organized around regression is not a system populated by broken, evil, or inherently malicious people.
It's a system where the environmental conditions required for higher-order thinking have been systematically, relentlessly undermined.
The people aren't broken, the environment is crushing them.
The mind under pressure is simply executing the code it evolved to run.
The tragedy is that the structural arrangements of our modern media and political institutions produce that intense pressure continuously.
Understanding this mechanism doesn't instantly fix the world. It doesn't magically make the comment section civil.
But as Starr notes in his conclusion, accuracy, in this context, is the beginning of anything useful.
You cannot repair a machine if you fundamentally misunderstand how the engine operates.
Accuracy is the beginning. I love that.
And we want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought, something for you to dissect on your own as you step back out into that noisy world.
Starr stated very clearly that these higher-order capacities, the reflection, the nuance, the profound ability to hold ambiguity,
They are never destroyed by regression. They are merely displaced. They're temporarily unavailable.
they're applications that have been forced closed to save battery life, but the software is still fully installed on the hard drive.
So if our political and media environment acts as this massive, continuous cognitive compressor, forcing us all into low power mode, the critical question becomes, what specific daily changes could you make to your own life?
What boundaries could you draw around your information diet, your digital consumption, or your social environments to act as a deliberate decompressor?
How do you architect a microenvironment for yourself that artificially lowers the threat perception and expands your compressed time?
Allowing those higher-order reflective capacities the safety they need to slowly boot back up.
If the overarching societal system refuses to provide the time and safety required for complex thought, we have to start building those sanctuaries for ourselves, one mind at a time.
It's about finding those moments of diagnostic muddy waters and cultivating the courage to sit with the discomfort of ambiguity rather than rushing for a clean, binary, moralized X-ray.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this has equipped you with a new structural lens to view the chaos around you. Keep exploring, keep protecting your ambiguity tolerance, and keep questioning the architecture of the world around you.
This has been The Psychology of Us. The work presented here is part of a public psychological archive by RJ Starr. It is educational and interpretive, not clinical or advisory. Episodes are published as finished reflections and are intended to be encountered as complete works.